Good afternoon,
Good
Mr.
afternoon.
Bennett. No, Mr. Collins.
Thanks, my Lord. My Lord, we have identified the risk assessment that was mentioned by the witness. He identified it quite properly by an A document number. I can now tell your Lordship that it's in bundle 20. It's document 61 and it's at page 1420. I think it might just be useful to have a very quick look at it just to check that we're looking at the right document. And I see my request for it to be brought up has been anticipated. It's a GGC document. It contains a lot of information, which I'm not, for my purposes, I'm going to go to the matrix, which is what my Lord was asking about. So if we scroll past 1420, I think we'll find it in somewhere like 1423, perhaps. No, keep going. There we are. Is this the matrix that you
Yes,
indicated?
that's the one, yes.
Where you have a likelihood table, may occur occasionally, for instance, is the one you've highlighted, and a severity table as well. And this matrix seemed to have been scored at 3 times 3 equals 9, which is the medium risk. Is that right?
Yes.
So we can see the reference to occasional. And then if we want to find out who was responsible for that, we need to scroll on. And we then see that the assessment has been done in 2021 by, or at least a series of people, Mr. Leach, Mr. Hart, Professor Leonard, Myra Campbell, Allan Gallagher, Tom Steele, Kirsty Stranigan. They all seem to have participated in this process. But that's the document you were referring to.
Yes, it is.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
But we'll move away from that, please, and back to the report where we'd reached page 691, where we're going to go to Ward 6A. Now, this is the ward about which I made a point, I think, in your introductory section. I take it you recognise that 6A was never designed to be a permanent home for immunocompromised patients, but was in essence a temporary home.
Yes.
You're aware of that?
Yes, I am, yes.
And in fact, if we go on to page 692, we see that point mentioned at the top, original design as a general ward with the air change rates, chill beams, no HEPA, etc. And then you specify that the period during which it was occupied. And now you say the ward specification was not increased. Now, why do you say that?
Well, it appeared that patients were being moved from Ward 2A because it was of general ward standard, and then they would be moved to another general ward. So it was, so basically they were moved out of the accommodation, not to be moved into a better accommodation, but to be moved into that accommodation to allow the Ward 2A to be upgraded.
And I take it you would accept that the decision to move from 2A somewhere
Yes.
was a decision that was taken by a range of individuals, including clinicians and infection control specialists.
I suppose they had no option.
And I think I'm right in saying that the most vulnerable people were placed in 4B. Were you aware of that?
I I don't remember seeing that document. I mean, I don't remember seeing any document stating that.
So you've identified in paragraph 8.32 what you saw as the deficiencies of that ward as a home for immunocompromised patients.
Yes.
And your note of the improvements, I think, appears at 8.34. Is that right, on page 693?
Yes.
So that's portable HEPA filter units. I think we discussed where they were earlier.
Yes.
In 3 rooms. These CAM-fill scrubbers in the ceilings, which we've discussed, and I won't go back to, and HEPA units in the, which says there, rooms and corridors. But clearly some steps were taken by the board
Yes. Yes.
to do something to this
Yes.
unit. Yeah. Thank you. Now, we'll just move on to 5C and D. This is a slightly more tricky tale to tell, I think, because the arrangements that were made to replicate the Brownlee infectious diseases units are not perhaps as clear as some others are. But in any event, the decision was made to move this unit to the new hospital and put it in 5C and D. As we understand it, the infectious diseases unit, as its name suggests, is intended to deal with people with infectious diseases. But it was being put in a ward which had a general design, which is your point here, isn't it?
I must admit, around this issue, I didn't really have that much information about the Brownlee ward that patients were coming from, and it's quite difficult. Infectious diseases is a very wide range of conditions, some of which are more likely to be infectious through the airborne route than others.
Clearly, the rooms on that ward would not be designed specifically for dealing with anyone with a particularly infectious disease, because they didn't have the negative pressure. Is that right?
A decision would be taken by clinicians on whether a patient would be regarded as being infectious and at risk to other people on the ward. In the instance, if it was a patient with tuberculosis or suspected tuberculosis, it would be expected to be placing them in a negative pressure isolation room.
So what you note is that the anticipation was that anyone who needed to be isolated would have to go to somewhere on another ward where there was a suitable room. Is that right? I think you say that in the middle of 836.
836, okay.
You say it was expected that any patient who needed to be isolated would be housed in other wards with isolation rooms.
Yeah, I see that, yes.
So that's the information you were given?
Yes.
And did you know how many of these rooms there were or what types they were?
No.
And what you then do is you record a letter of concern from infectious diseases physicians stating that they weren't clear if the high dependency unit rooms had enough air changes to keep staff safe, and we do have multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis presenting commonly, which is of particular concern. Just pausing at that point, it is multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis, a disease of particular concern in terms of how you look after the patient.
Yes, because it's harder to treat. So if you have a multi-drug resistant strain of tuberculosis, it will impact on your treatment and maybe your prognosis.
And is it infectious?
Yes, airborne infection.
And we see a note on page 694 from Dr. Inkster saying that there were no negative pressure rooms. A negative pressure room would be a suitable room for placing an infectious patient in, I take it.
That'd be the normal way of doing it, yes.
Yeah. And then the question is a normal room.
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the concerns that you seem to have picked up, mentioned at paragraph 8.38, where you say tests had indicated neutral to positive pressure in rooms where TB patients were cared for, thus spreading pathogens into the corridor and potentially other rooms. If a room with a TB patient in did have neutral to positive pressure, is that concern correct or not?
That is correct, yes. If the room is positive pressure, then theoretically the air from that room will be spread into other rooms.
And then there's a similar point made in the same paragraph about immunocompromised patients being cared for with neutral to slightly negative pressure, thus potentially sucking pathogens into the room from the corridor. Is that a fair concern?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, yes. I mean, you do not want to have immunocompromised. I mean, this is one of the things when you have an infectious disease ward. You have, there's different infections, and you don't want to have somebody with infectious tuberculosis anywhere near somebody immunocompromised.
You record in 839 that adjustments had been made to ventilation, and there was a report that all rooms had achieved a notionally negative pressure. Can we come back? I think you may have touched on this earlier. Is notionally negative a valuable thing to have achieved?
I prefer seeing they had a negative pressure of X pascals. I think would be more useful. I mean, notionally negative pressure, I don't know what that means really.
Well, you pick up in paragraph 8.40 on page 695. You say currently the ID unit is achieving air change rates between 2.7 and 3.2 and achieving a notionally negative pressure regime ranging from 0 to negative 3.5. Now, is that good enough in your view?
No, I mean, I think the fact it's not monitored, the fact there's no alarm system and some rooms are running at neutral pressure. I mean, saying that, if they don't have any TB patients, then, but I mean, I wouldn't house a TB patient in that sort of facility.
Yeah. And your point about the alarm is you don't know if the pressure changes.
Yeah, so if there's no monitoring of the negative pressure, then you don't necessarily know that it's performing as required.
Yeah. And then you point out that now there is access to 3 negative pressure isolation rooms in the critical care unit.
Yes,
That's something that wasn't available initially.
No, I don't think so. And I remember seeing some negative pressure rooms when I visited, and they seem to be good.
Thank you. When we go on to the next section, we're going to come back to the word bundle that we picked up very early in your evidence. And we find that in paragraph 8.41, where you say the prevention of nosocomial infection involves a range of preventative measures, often called bundles. And what you're doing is looking at ventilation, because you're
Indeed,
not
yes.
in a position to look at the other ones. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Now, the first thing that crops up in your consideration of this, which starts at page 696, is an exchange of materials that I think you saw when you were preparing this report, that sometimes described as the M&E log, where there are proposals to reduce the air exchange rates. That's what we perhaps touched on a little bit earlier on when we were looking at Mr. Seaborn's email.
Yeah.
And you note on page 697 that you think the rationale seems to have been energy efficiency and a BREEAM rating.
Yes.
Now, are you able to tell, as a matter of contract reading, what the which rooms the reduced rate was intended to apply to? Or is that not your expertise?
It seemed to be throughout the hospital, I mean, but...
And I think you recognise that so far as chilled beams are concerned, the advice has changed since the hospital was built.
Yes, it has, yes.
Now, I think it will be said, when you refer to chilled beams, you talk about them being prohibited now, but is a correct wording something like without the approval of the ventilation group?
I'd have to look back on it, but the implication is not to be used in patient care areas, which includes bedrooms.
So what we're then about to do, I think, Mr. Bennett, is to look at different areas, and you then form a view as to whether there's an increased risk due to lower air change rates. Is that right?
Yes.
And in fact, you pose that question in 847, leave aside CBUs, you say, does reducing the air change rate to 2.5 from 6 and using CBUs create an increased infection risk if, for the sake of argument, CBUs don't add one? So just looking at the air change rate. So you start by acknowledging that patients in single rooms are less exposed to hazards, presumably, than a ward. Is that right?
Yes, I mean by reasons of distance and reasons of possibly the door being closed.
And you want to say the patients will still be exposed to visitors, nursing staff and support staff, and doors will not always be closed.
Yeah.
So there will still be exposure. That's your view.
Yes.
So if we go on to 698, what you're setting out here is how you work out what the impact is of air change rates on dilution. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And you say it will take longer to remove any contaminant.
Yes.
Can you just take us through this calculation so His Lordship understands what you're doing here?
Well, basically, this is actually taken from a table from Chin and Sousa, but there is a...
From where? Can we
from the reference. But there is a standard equation, which I forget, which you can use to calculate this. So if you assume that the room is perfectly mixed and you've got 2.5 air changes, it would take you 56 minutes to remove 90%, of the particulate in the room. However, at 6 air changes, because there's more air changes, it would only take 23 minutes to remove 90% of the contaminant. So by increasing the air change rate, you dilute quicker.
Yeah.
But of course, that only matters if there is a hazard there in the first place.
And just so we have the reference, this is to the paper from Chin and Selister,
Yeah.
which is referenced in the footnote and is in,
Yes.
I think we'll find in bundle 20. We needn't bring it up on the screen, thank you. So no, thank you. We'll just go back to the report. So if there is a contaminant in the room for any reason, from a patient or a visitor or anyone else, or a member of staff, that's the difference it makes to dilution.
Yes.
So you then go on to deal in paragraph 850 with this question of slight negative pressure, because there's an extract, I think, in the ensuite. Yes. And what difference does that make to the discussion you're having here?
I think 850, what I'm trying to say is there is potential, there can be potential for spread of air from one room to another room. So it's possible for a room to go positive pressure due to a variety of things, such as temperature differences. It could be air movements caused by other doors opening or lifts, etc., etc. But there's always scope for fluctuations of pressure at those low levels.
So so you're talking there about the possibility, for the sake of argument, of a contaminant in room A getting into room B.
Yes, yeah. I mean, for example, hotel rooms are almost always at 0 to negative pressure because they've got extracts in the toilet. But if somebody smokes in a hotel room and you're walking past the corridor, it's not. You very possibly will smell it because of the fluctuations.
Thank you.
If I can just take you back to 849. These calculations are in relation to, tell me if I'm wrong about this, a sort of specific event.
Yes.
You have X hypothesi
Yes.
a source of infection within the room, such as an infected patient. And one supposes an event, in other words, a sneeze, for example.
Yes.
And then these figures tell you what is happening to the air in the room after that sneeze.
Yes.
But of course, if there's a subsequent sneeze, again, there's an aerosol.
But there will always be that
Yeah.
difference, even if it's a continuous source. It'd be a different equation I'd have to use, but there'd always be that similar difference.
Thank you. Just to I'm making sure that I'm keeping up.
That's fine.
Sorry, Mr. Conn.
I think what you then set out in paragraph 851 is a point that we've actually already covered, which is you would have expected some kind of written assessment for the change from 6 to 2.5 or 3, and you haven't seen any such thing.
No. I mean, you haven't managed to provide it to me. But,
So you then go on in paragraph 8.52, page 699, to say that reduced air change rate may have the greatest impact in times where there are cases of highly transmissible respiratory viruses. So is this you in effect using your COVID knowledge to think about highly transmissible respiratory viruses?
I think this would possibly be foreseeable before COVID, for influenza and RSV. So, yeah, I mean, those diseases seem to be spread, at least in part, by small particle size aerosols. So, due to the lower air change rate, it seems feasible that there could be increased transmission of such agents between patients and staff and patients.
Now, when you wrote this paragraph, you said in the middle of the paragraph, the lower air changes will increase the chances of airborne transmission between patients, between staff and between patients, and between patients and staff.
Yeah, that's what it's
and no doubt visitors come in somewhere in there if,
yes, you know.
if they're not restricted for any reason.
Yes.
When you say that the lower air changes will increase the risk, is that a personal view, or are you taking that from some other source?
I think it's probably a personal view.
So that in the next paragraph, when you say it seems likely that reduced air change rates could lead to an increased rate of transmission of respiratory viruses between patient, staff and visitors, that's essentially the same point. This is your view.
I mean, I would say, let's take a spectrum here. There are people who believe that influenza and COVID are transmitted basically by close contact, and they're there. And then there's the people who believe they're entirely transmitted by small particle aerosols, and they're there. I'm in the middle, so I wouldn't say. I would say I'm moderate in that field, and it is an area of a lot of controversy.
I'm assuming when you indicate that spectrum, the whole spectrum is respectable views.
Yes.
Yeah.
And somebody in the middle of that spectrum, as you say you are,
yes,
might think that lower air change rates would increase the risk.
Yes, yeah.
And I see you then reference in 854 a concern that had been picked up by someone else about Mycobacterium abscessus and whether that might be influenced by the air change rates. So on page 700, in paragraph 855, you say that's another type of example where air change rates might make a difference.
Yes, I mean, there's not just in this hospital, but in other hospitals, there are concerns about transmission of opportunistic pathogens between cystic fibrosis patients, and in particular Mycobacterium abscessus. Now, I don't know how relevant. I don't know, how cystic fibrosis patients are managed in the hospital. So I can't really go too far with that one.
But nevertheless, your view is, if I'm picking it up correctly, and I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, your view is that is an example from what you've read of another situation where a reduced air change rate would increase risk.
Yes, I mean, it could also be a condition in which, because they know they've got a low air change rate, they actually leave a longer time between seeing patients as a mitigation to make up for that. So
yeah, so there are ways of dealing with the issue, in
yes,
effect, or maybe,
yeah,
but there's still a risk from the lower air change rates.
yeah, or having to deal with that may mean that the hospital is less efficient.
Yeah. And then you make the point in 856, which we've already discussed, that getting it right at the beginning is easier because later on it's very difficult to fix. And we've heard about that from other witnesses as well. And then you summarize that in 857, and we're dealing here with general wards. Lower air change rate than recommended by guidance would potentially increase the risk of transmission of respiratory infection between patients, staff and visitors, especially in winter. And then you say, without further analysis, the magnitude of increased risk can't be quantified. So you say there's an increased risk, but you can't put a number on it.
No, I can't put a number on it, no.
I think the point that might be put to challenge you on this is, if you can't quantify it, how do you know it exists at all?
There's a lot of things you know exist that you can't quantify. The risk will depend, on the virulence of the virus, the transmissibility of the virus that you're dealing with, and a number of other issues. You can do this analysis. You'd need to make a certain number of assumptions, but I think you know which way it's going. There is an increased risk. I can say there's increased risk, but whether that increased risk, the significance of that increased risk is very hard to put a finger on. And it's not within I think if you wanted to play a bit with the mathematics of this, you could do it, and you could probably come up with at least something that makes sense, but it's not my speciality.
No, whatever the issue is over quantification, are you still convinced it's an increased risk?
Yes.
Right. Let's move on. Chilled beam units. Every time I say those words, people in various parts of the room groan silently, of course, because we've touched on chilled beam units many times. You deal with this, you say, well, they're a cost-efficient, energy-efficient and cost-effective option for cooling the environment. You pick up on the concerns, leaving aside concerns raised informally in terms of papers. I think I'm right in saying the first paper on this was Dr. Inkster's paper that you know of.
Yes, I mean, one thing I want to make quite plain is I've never really had I don't have a really good knowledge of CBUs. I don't regard myself as any sort of expert in their operation, and I've never fiddled with one.
And we've already picked up from your earlier evidence that you accept that the original advice didn't prohibit them, and now, well, question about the precise wording, but they're clearly not in favour anymore for patient rooms.
No.
So when you narrate on page 701 the kind of things that seem to have happened with the chilled beam units, you're picking that up from the materials that the inquiry has provided about the concerns that were raised and the investigations that were done. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
And then, since I know this is the point his Lordship is interested in paragraph 859, you're distinguishing between chilled beam units and Swigon Parasol heating cooling comfort modules. What's the distinction?
I think I probably have taken that from the Inkster paper because, yeah, as I say, I wanted to see one of these units, but I never got an opportunity to actually see one of those units. So,
It may be that the answer is in the name, that a chilled beam unit chills and a heating cooling unit can also heat.
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, if the CBUs used in the QUH are not strictly CBUs, they're still called CBUs in every single piece of documentation I think I've read. So, I think the...
And in the end of paragraph 8.59,
well, just at the risk of giving this unnecessary focus, you do use the expression not strictly chilled beam units. Now, what I understand, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, it's a mechanism whereby a flow of air, either simply by induction or by supply, passes over a coil.
Yeah.
Within the coil is water. The water may be either above the temperature of the above the ambient temperature or below the ambient temperature. And the purpose of the device is to encourage an induction effect of the air within the space. Now, am I right about that or am I wrong?
I think you've explained that better than I would explain it.
And the other thing is that they will tend to be either attached to the ceiling or, as I understand the position, to be in the hospital within the roof space.
I never had an opportunity to see one of these in operation, and I feel a little bit hobbled by that. So I'm wondering whether, again, Andrew might be better to ask in-depth questions. I wanted to see, I hoped in my visit to be able to go to the workshop and see one of these and be explained how it uses. And, that's the way I best understand things. And I feel, as I say, hobbled a little bit because I didn't really get the opportunity.
Thank you. Mr. Connell.
You make a point at the end of 859 that you think they're quite an ingenious system, perhaps designed for offices and meeting rooms. And then you're picking up a point, no doubt from your experience on various projects. You say 860, what evidence was sought by the design team for assurance that these units were safe to use in hospitals? And you say this large number of units were purchased. So would you have expected some kind of research to be done on this? Is that what you're getting at here before they were introduced?
As I say, I'm not an expert in CBUs, but in my working career, I have a great deal of experience of HVAC units in rooms leaking and causing problems, and I think probably many people have had that experience in the past. I would expect that since they're being installed in patient rooms, that people would be asking questions about reliability and performance, and especially since they're buying so many of these units and relying on so much units, I would expect to have quite a high level of assurance that they will do the job without causing problems. Now, maybe it's very possible that the manufacturers told them they've been used in American hospitals for the last 20 years without problem. That may have happened, but that'd be my feeling. You're introducing a new water source into the room, often above the patient's bed. How reliable are the connectors? How reliable, what's the likelihood of leakage? Those sort of questions. Maybe they were asked, but I haven't seen any documentation.
Yeah, one of the points you pick up on is perhaps the point you mentioned about American hospitals. You say one of the things that you would expect to have been sought was evidence about previous use in healthcare environments.
Yes.
You haven't seen anything.
I haven't seen anything. I mean, maybe it was done, but I haven't seen anything.
And the only thing you have seen is a reference to an offer to come and look at a mock-up in the manufacturer's laboratories.
Yes.
I see. So what you were referencing there, am I right in understanding, was other types of air conditioning, if I can use that phrase, units having had problems of leaks and so on?
Yes, I think. I mean, it's not beyond the realms of possibility, of a reasonable person having those concerns, I don't think.
So going on to page 702, as you say, there's an extra water supply. Not, we've heard from other evidence, a sterile water supply, a water supply that was never intended to come out of the closed loop that it was in. There seems to have been some issue over connections.
Yes.
You think that was I think what you say here, that was a foreseeable risk? Connections.
Well, I mean, I'm not a plumber, but I would imagine that different fittings have got their different risks and different failure rates. And obviously compression fittings are quite high spec, but I would imagine, and I don't know, I mean, to some extent, this is where we cross over a little bit with the water experts, but I would imagine that if you are going to stick a water connector in the roof above a patient, you're going to want to go for a pretty good fitting to make sure there isn't any potential leakage. It's an area that you don't really want to have water leaking.
And then the next point you pick up is on dew point controls, which seem to have been originally intended but subsequently not fitted.
Yes. And I think that was specified in the HTM for CBUs, even the first time they were mentioned.
Again, the possibility of this, dew point issue, do you think that was foreseeable?
Well, I mean, you're told to do dew point control. I mean, that is the recommendation, and they said they were going to do dew point control. So you would imagine that there was a reason to do it, and if you don't do it, something bad will happen.
Yeah. So you then go on in paragraph 8.63, essentially to try and pull some of these threads together. You say, well, what's the potential impact? You say having a reservoir of opportunistic pathogens in the ceiling of a patient room is not a perfect situation. Where is this reservoir that you're referring to?
Well, I mean, Teresa Inkster was taking swabs of these units and was finding potential opportunistic pathogens in them on a quite regular basis.
Again, there's a risk here, you say, but not one that you can put a number on.
Well, the opportunistic pathogens need to get into the person's body in order to have an impact. So the likelihood of the route from the drip or from the condensation event to the patient is very difficult to map. I mean, the obvious thing is through some sort of wound or skin abrasion, and I think the likelihood of that is unlikely. I think it's interesting that in the latest HTM they say in patient care areas. So I think they're worried about potential people having catheters, people having, oh man, what do they call them again? Having
Hickman lines.
Hickman lines and things like that. So they're worried about those sort of things, I would imagine. It's very, I mean, there's no volume, there's, you can't, there's very little you can put numbers to here, but there are potential routes that you can foresee.
And then you make a point about the cleaning burden, which seems to have perhaps been higher than anticipated, 6 months having been mentioned initially as an appropriate.
I mean, it's an interesting thing. If they were quoted by the manufacturer 6 months and then it ends up being 6 weeks or whenever, I wonder whether they reported that back to the manufacturer. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and as you point out, that's cleaning one of these in the ceiling of a room with an ill patient in presumably causes all kinds of challenges for the cleaning teams.
Well, I mean, as I think I read, it's a 2-man job involving a ladder a man on top of the ladder and the man holding the ladder. So it's not going to be done with a patient in the room.
So you discuss this and then you come to a conclusion at paragraph 8.67, where you say, well, the issue might not have been apparent at the start, but it is apparent now. It's not acceptable, especially for vulnerable patients. Risks are not insignificant. And you actually suggest these should be discontinued, presumably in patient areas, is that right? But halfway through this paragraph.
I mean, I'm just going with the SHT MO301.
Right. Well, let's move on to another.
I also say when practical, because
Yep.
I think it's.
Sorry, just so I'm getting your answer there. Yes, you're following what is said in the latest version of SHT TM0301, which is that they shouldn't. They cause problems in patient rooms, and generally shouldn't be used except with permission of the ventilation group.
Yes.
And you read that as saying basically don't use them in patient rooms.
I said when practical, discontinued with priority given to wards with the most vulnerable patients. I mean, it may not be practical. You don't want to have somebody in a room that is 10 degrees centigrade or 40 degrees centigrade, and if they're the only way that you can control the temperature at present, then that's as being. I mean, this is a problem. I mean, I think that one of the issues is when you've got a blank sheet, you can do different things. However, when you've got a pre-existing hospital, and you need to adjust things, life becomes harder.
Thank you. We're now moving on to another topic, deficiencies in UEH wards, infectious patients. And you've already explained to us that the kind of protection that that they may need, essentially a negative pressure room to prevent pathogens affecting staff or presumably others, visitors in the ward or anything else. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I've the effect of the lower air change rate is to people who are in the room with the patient. But
now again, on page 706 on this occasion, you say that having a lower air change rate will increase the risk of transmission of airborne disease. So just pausing there, is that the same point you're making from earlier about how the air change rate works?
yes, but in this it's probably heightened because we know that the person in the room, if it's tuberculosis, is generating aerosols of an infectious agent.
And when you say, again, I need to ask you, when you say this, having a lower air change rate will increase the risk of transmission, is that your personal view again?
Well, yes. I mean, I think it'd be a lot of people's view with tuberculosis.
Because you say it again a little further down that paragraph, within the single room having an air change rate of 2.5 instead of say 10, well, that would be an even bigger calculation than the one you gave us for 2.5 as opposed to 6.
Yeah.
And you say it will increase the exposure of those entering the patient room.
Yes.
And then you take a point that I think has already been made, that there may be other things that can be done to protect someone coming into the room.
Yeah, oh yes, yes.
such as PPE and so on. But you say it still increases the exposure.
Yes. I mean, you may already have the mitigate. You may already be wearing RPA anyway. So therefore, it is a mitigation, but maybe you're using it anyway. So you've still got that increased risk.
Yeah, you say, I mean, let's make sure we're getting the acronym correct. RPE,
Respiratory protective equipment.
respiratory protective equipment.
Yes, sir.
And you say in paragraph 870, no RPE is 100% effective.
Yes.
What's that based on?
Based on a very, very large range of studies. I mean, you'll never get a, well, it's like you'll never get 100% effective filter, but your RP is even less effective.
So
Again, just
you dropped the
sorry.
end of your, that sentence dropped away a little bit. Can we just go back and pick that up again?
Sorry, entirely my fault, and can I apologise for speaking over you, Mr. Connell? It was just picking up on, as you say, the acronym. Now, it's respiratory personal equipment. Am I to imagine a face mask?
Yes, probably an N95.
Probably
a N95 face mask.
right.
So
Anything else?
I don't know what they use in the hospital, but yeah, I mean that'd probably be the normality. And because with something like that, the filter material is of a certain standard, but the problem is it's all about the seal around your face.
Mhm.
So they normally perform less well because you'll get a little bit of leakage across the seal.
And
Sorry, Mr. Connell.
that conclusion as to it not being 100% effective, you said was evidenced by any number of studies. Is that
Yes.
right? So you're quite confident in your conclusion.
I'm very confident.
And then you actually go on to indicate that low air changes had been postulated
Yes,
as a cause of an outbreak in the UK. Is that right?
that's correct.
And you tell us which one that was, and you give us a reference to the paper. In fact, you then mention it again in paragraph 8.71. Is that right?
Yes.
You say this has most often been reported in HIV patients. It would be expected to be a possibility with other airborne infections such as COVID, measles, etc. Is that right?
Yes, yeah.
In the next paragraph, you're dealing with a slightly more nuanced point, which is if you have negative pressure creating a directional airflow, I want you to stop me if I'm getting this wrong. If you have negative pressure with a directional airflow, but the precise number of pascals of negative pressure is not as good as aimed for as a lower figure, not nominal, not 0.1 or any of these figures, but nevertheless lower. You're less concerned about that, is that right?
As long as it's monitored and as long as it doesn't go positive.
So you're still getting the airflow, which is the key. The fact that it's at it's
You're getting
at
the
4
directional,
pascals
yeah.
instead of
As long as
6
it-
or 6
As long as
instead
the
of...
air's going in the right direction, yes.
Right. And then you touch on PPVL rooms briefly in the next paragraph and say, well, if these work correctly, then that's fine.
Yeah.
And you're not normally needing HEPA filtered exhausting. And then you touch on chill beam units again on page 708. So we now move to the next category, which is neutropenic or immunosuppressed patients. And they are mentioned on page 708 in paragraph 877. Now, so we've come from the patient in the infectious state, which we've just discussed. Now we have a patient to whom I think some of the clinicians would suggest infection is the real enemy because they can't fight it. Yeah. And that's the point you make, I think, in 877 at the start. So what you're saying here is that the reduced clearance of anything from their room will increase their exposure.
Theoretically, yes.
Well, theoretically, why the qualification? If there is a contaminant of a pathogen in the room.
Yes, if that's what I mean. Yes. So I mean, for example, if you've got a room that is HEPA filtered, and the patient has minimal contact with other staff or visitors, then I suppose the air change rate won't really do much. It won't really do much because there's nothing coming in. So that's why I think I make that proviso.
But in the paragraph in question, you reference the SHTM and indeed HTM provision for positive pressure, 10 air changes, and HEPA
Yes,
filter.
that's the recommendation, yes.
First of all, can I ask you, based on anything you've seen, is there any basis for departing from that recommendation for that type of patient that you're aware of?
No.
And you say these ventilation values by themselves and together provide a highly protective environment.
Yes.
So if you then take your hypothetical patient who never sees anybody, who's in the room untouched, you then, I suppose, have the next possibility, which they're immunocompromised, they're in the room, but a member of staff or members of staff or other hospital team members or visitors or whatever enter the room. Presumably, is there then a risk of some opportunistic pathogen emerging?
There could be.
There could be.
Could be a risk. Is there a redundancy in that expression?
I mean, the person entering the room will be wearing some form of clothing that will reduce the chances of transmission of any disease. They will probably they'll be wearing something covering their mouth to stop them generating stuff. So there are other mitigations taking place. So in this case, I'm not so worried about the air change rate, but on the other hand, they should be having 10 air change. That's what's recommended.
I think my point was really maybe just a linguistic point. I mean, to me, if I come across the word risk, that suggests something that could happen,
Yes,
but wouldn't necessarily happen. It was just I wondered if there was some nuance you were introducing with could be a risk.
I mean, part of this is a language problem. Everything
Right.
there is always a risk. There is always a risk of anything. You know, there's a risk. There's a risk a meteorite is going to strike me now, but
I haven't arranged that.
Right.
So I think sometimes I think that is a real issue you actually do get with the use of terms like risk is is something that is quantifiable.
Mm-hmm.
But so a risk can mean a 1 in 100,000 million or a 1 in 2, and I think that's sometimes and the problem is you cannot always put your finger on that. And also the questions you're asking, I don't know the other precautions taken in this hospital that aren't involved with ventilation to any great degree. So if they actually send somebody in a negative pressure spacesuit with all air coming out of being HEPA filtered, and which is totally sterile, then there isn't really a risk. But I don't think they're possibly doing that. But you know, you see where I'm trying to.
Well, if I can try and tie this together, if you're, so the group of patients we're considering here are ones that are peculiarly vulnerable.
Yes.
So, you know, there is a special issue for them about
Yes.
any opportunistic pathogen, if we're just using that phrase for the moment. That's correct, isn't it?
I mean, what I'm possibly getting, not communicating very well, is I'm a lot more concerned about the HEPA filter and the lack of positive pressure than I am about the air changes.
Yeah. Well, I understand that. But if we just stick to the air changes for the moment, what you have then is a patient who is particularly vulnerable.
Yes.
And the possibility that due to something that happens in the room or due to someone who's in the room, an opportunistic pathogen emerges. That's what we're talking about, isn't it? That possibility.
Yes.
And if it does, then air change, in effect, you say it plays a part in keeping them safe.
Yes.
Is that why you've said, well, combined together with the other protections?
Yes.
Because the HEPA filtration that you mentioned is primarily focused on the air source coming into the room from
Yes.
the general air supply,
Yes.
as opposed to what happens in the room.
Yes. So, yeah.
The positive pressure that you've mentioned does prevent anything going on in the corridor, for instance, entering them. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
So if you then move from, I'll be doing what you were doing a minute ago, waving my arms around. If you go from, let's say, one extreme, the air coming from the air handling system into the room, that's HEPA.
Yes.
At the door's end, you're stopping anything getting in by the positive pressure. The part, am I right in then understanding, the part played by the air changes in the middle, because it affects what happens when anyone else is inside that room?
Yes. I mean, if the air is sterile, then, and there's no microorganisms, the air change rate, that doesn't really matter at all. But if there is something in the room that is producing potentially infectious particulate aerosol of an opportunistic pathogen, then the higher the air changes, the higher the air changes, the less the person is exposed.
Thank you. Now, can we just move then to the next page, 878? I think that at the start of that paragraph, you say the hospital was originally designed to have an air change rate of 2.5 air changes on all wards, much lower than the recommended 10 for specialist ventilation areas. Why do you say all wards? That's one of the questions I've been asked to put to you. Where do you get the idea that it's for all wards? Is that just by reading the documents that we've seen?
Well, that seemed to be the implication of the documents I was given about the original design process. There wasn't any statement there that there was any alternative areas with higher or lower air change rates.
And you I think, didn't see anything to show any significant discussion with infection control people in the material you were given.
I saw none.
And in fact, what you then do, having narrated essentially the matters we've just been discussing at the end of paragraph 8.78, you say that wards designed with a low air change rate must have caused concern in staff coming from the Beatson.
Well, I would imagine that the Beatson were told that their facilities were designed to provide the best environment for their patients. So to be moved to a facility in which the specifications were dropped, I think would cause concern of any professional person.
In the next paragraph, you deal with this nominal pressure point, which we've now touched on more than one occasion. But if we could go over the page to 710, what you're talking about there is positive pressure rooms and pressure differentials. And then you say about halfway through the paragraph, the increased risk cannot be easily measured. Is this another one where it's difficult to put numbers on anything?
Sorry, which?
Sorry, page 710. It's
Yeah, I see, yeah.
Yeah, just after the reference to JC, increased risk this posed to the patients cannot easily be measured, as the protective impact hasn't been quantified.
Well, I mean, the point is there's not been any, what I'm trying to say here is that there's not really been any studies showing positive pressure rooms are any better than non-positive pressure rooms. So there's no actual evidence of how effective positive pressure is.
But that's been provided in successive HTMs and SHTMs since the early 2000s, is that right?
Yes, I mean, I think we all, well, you know, we all know that what we know is a positive pressure room will stop the ingress of agents into the room.
Now, presumably that's
What
just
we
a
don't
matter
know,
of,
what we don't know is in practice how effective that is in improving patient outcomes.
Yeah.
That's because those studies have not been done.
I was just going to ask you that the practical effect of it keeping stuff out is presumably just a matter of physics.
Yes.
That the air will not flow from a lower pressure to a higher pressure.
Yes.
And then you say that you think it would be the expectation of family and so on that vulnerable patients would be housed in rooms of the specified standard.
Well, yes, especially if people have been transferred or have knowledge of the facilities pre-existing the Queen Elizabeth Hospital and the Beatson and other places. And if they read things in the...
And the JC standard, which, as we discussed earlier, it starts with a general statement and then looks at some details, but not as many as some other requirements. You quoted it here, I think, again, saying that the unit should be of a design that minimizes airborne microbial contamination.
Yeah.
And you give your view that that's not met if you don't have the things we've just been talking about.
I can't see how it is met, no.
So again, just for completeness, what you then do in the next section is pick up the same point about directional airflow and precise numbers of pascals, that if you've got a lower number of pascals, but not down to the, the boundary, then provided the airflow is maintained, the risk is not significant. That's essentially what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the risk is significantly increased.
And then we're going to pick up exactly the same point again in relation to HEPA filtration, because you point out in paragraph 881 on paragraph 711 that there is actually no studies that show the precise effect of HEPA filtered units on patient outcome.
There's one study that seems to show a slight positive impact, but it's not statistically significant.
But in terms of, well, first of all, it's been in the recommendations for some time. If you have the knowledge that the external air that everybody is otherwise breathing contains opportunistic pathogens, or may do, which seems to be what you've told us, is that right?
Yes.
And you want to prevent an immunocompromised person encountering any of these if you possibly can.
Yes.
How would you do it without a HEPA filter?
I think that's the thing. I mean, I think, as Professor Gibson says, it's inconceivable, isn't it?
You then deal with chilled beams, which we won't need to touch on again. And on the next page, sealed rooms and validating and commissioning. Because as you quite rightly point out, no doubt, if you haven't validated to check that it's doing what it's meant to do, you don't know what it's doing.
Yeah.
So we're on page 713 now. We've got the CAMFIL units mentioned again, and you've already explained what you know or don't about that. Portable HEPA filters again. You've given us a little more information perhaps on what's known about portable HEPA filters when we go to page 714. You say they've been tested in laboratory conditions and in a COVID ward.
Yes.
But notwithstanding, you say there's no published evidence of their effectiveness in reducing nosocomial infection. Is that right?
Yes, people have tried, but it's not happened.
Yeah. And one of the issues that you then pick up is, well, we know that in effect they scrub the air. So if there's a pathogen wandering about, it can get drawn in and removed. But you say we don't know what they do to air change numbers in whatever location they are.
Well, I mean, that can be calculated, but nobody seems to. I haven't seen any information that people have said, okay, we're going to put in portable air cleaners that will increase the theoretical air change rate from 2.5 to 6, for example.
Right. Again, just to make sure that I'm following that. What you're saying has not been studied is the not even quite sure if I know.
Okay, okay. Okay, air change rate measures the amount of fresh air that comes in per volume of the room per hour. Now, what you can do with portable air cleaners, you can say what they do is they produce additional clean air.
Right.
By filtering out.
Okay.
So if you've got...
It's an additional supply.
Yes, so if you've got an additional 100 litres a second going through a portable HEPA filter, you then can add that to your air changes, your air change rate calculation, to give you a theoretical higher air change rate.
Can I just check something with you, because I don't think this is something I don't think I'd picked up. I think I've been thinking of portable HEPA filters as simply, presumably they must have some mechanical mechanism for moving air through them. But I've been assuming that the source of the air is within the room,
Yes,
and the output of the air is still
yes,
within the room.
yes,
So I can see how that changes, or adding a portable HEPA filter may have some impact on movement within the room.
yes.
But does it have any impact on air change rate within the total space? Am I being a bit
it's
slow
all,
on this?
it's a theoretical thing. It's clean air. It adds to the cleanliness of the air.
Yeah, it's
Yes.
clean air.
Yes.
Yeah.
So some people use the flow through a HEPA portable to increase their theoretical air change rate.
Okay, but it is theoretical. In other words,
Yes.
It's introducing one mechanism
Yes.
to compensate for a different mechanism.
Yes. But it indicates a better quality of air within the area it's used.
Right. It's not diluting the air, which is what the air change rate does.
Yes.
But it is removing particles.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
I know it's it's a funny sort of concept.
Well, and no doubt I'm a bit slow on this, but
it's
important that I keep up.
Yeah.
Right, Mr. Connell.
Right, Lord. Now, I'm moving now towards the conclusions of your report, and I'm going to skate past one or two areas for reasons that I'll explain as we go. In section 9, other issues, you touch on prophylaxis, and you pick up on some references in documents you've been provided of patients being given prophylaxis because of some of the issues with the building. And you say, and I won't delay too much on this because I'm going to come back to it in a moment, on page 717, you say you don't have the expertise to judge whether these prophylactic drugs would have any adverse effect on patients, but it'd be my opinion that they should not be routinely used to protect patients from deficiencies in hospital ventilation systems. And I'm going to come to a point at which you give a further answer on that point just in a few minutes. And then you touch on a topic which regrettably we're going to have to hear a bit more about at a later stage of your evidence, which is pigeons. And you say halfway through 9.8, or 2/3 of the way through 9.8, that there were reports of dead birds and excreta in service floors common in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. And the question is, well, where did you get that information from? That there were reports of birds and excreta?
Well, there were numerous sources. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be referred. Nobody picked up there wasn't a reference.
Well, you have a separate paper on Cryptococcus.
And there are photographs I've seen and maps I've seen. And
okay. And then you touch briefly on thermal wheels, but we know they were removed from 2A. We've already got there. And you touch again on air sampling, and you've told us about air sampling. And I'm not going to ask you about the sewage works because that's a different topic, which is going to be covered elsewhere. Just wanted to ask you about a point you make on page 720, which is flexibility. I think we may have picked this up very briefly earlier on, but you say there a new build hospital will be expected to have a long operational life and so on. And why do you mention flexibility in the context of ventilation?
I think when you're building a large building, which you hope will be operating for many years in the future. You have to realize that things will change, and there will be differences in the way we treat patients. There will be differences in the equipment we use, etc., etc. Therefore, allowing some flexibility in a design, whether it be allow for space for additional air handling units or larger ducts, may be wise. We can't predict the future. It may be that with the new government being so keen in prevention, we won't have hospitals in 5 years' time. But it may be that we have more compromised people. It may be we have more need for specialist ventilation systems. There's a lot of concerns about antimicrobial resistance. If people's fears are true, then we're going to have to be a lot more careful with in our hospitals to prevent transmission of those infections. So it's just the idea that if you have a major program that's supposed to be running for 50, 100 years, you've got to maybe think a little bit flexibility.
In paragraph 916, you express your view that the guidance should be used, and then you say, well, if there's going to be a derogation, I just want to make sure why you use the precise phrases here. You say there should be a written rationale agreed by all interested parties, including infection control, that clearly explain the rationale and why this will not impact in patient comfort and outcome. Is that last part important? I mean, we've heard about, well, you should write something down explaining why, but you've mentioned patient comfort and outcome.
Yeah. Well, outcome is probably risk of infection I'm not sure I put patient comfort in it, but you would.
So is outcome more important than comfort then?
I would imagine in that context, yes. But I think the general principle is that if you're building it to a lower spec than is recommended by guidance, then give a rationale for it. You might be right. You might have. There may be a good reason for it, but you need to give that reason and work it through. And I think you also, to some extent, I haven't written here, but for staff. If you're moving staff from a hospital that's built in a certain way to another hospital that's of a lower standard, I don't know what that does for staff morale and staff and the way staff look at things.
Well, can we come now to your conclusions of this report? I'll come to the questions you asked about it in a moment. These appear first on page 722. And I'm not going to go through all the conclusions that simply repeat the points that we've just picked up. Yeah. But you make a point in 10.4 that appeared to be a disconnect between the design team and experienced infection control professionals located in the Glasgow area in York Hill and Brownlee, who don't seem to have been consulted. And you say that this assumption is likely given the limited information suggesting there was little, if any, collaboration between the design team and the professionals. Now, I think question to you might be, well, how do you know any of that? How do you know what liaison there was or was not with infection control professionals?
Well, I think during a lot of the documentation, there are members of staff expressing surprise and alarm at some of the facilities, when they are shown them. I mean, I must admit, I'm not an expert in the building process, and I know in my field sometimes you get a problem is that if you have a PFI build or something like that, and I don't know any of this, but you know, people don't see it until it's complete. They're not part of the process. They only see it when it's complete. So I don't know whether that was one of the problems, but it just seems really odd to me in that you've got some well-recognized facilities built to a certain standard, and if you want to replicate those facilities, why aren't, I mean, and maybe it's not, but why aren't these people being involved in the design of the new study? I know that when we build new specialist laboratories, my old organization, you get the people who ran the old laboratories and say, okay, does this look good to you? It just, I really don't quite understand it.
I missed that last sentence. You were giving the example of building a new laboratory.
Yes.
And if you're building a new laboratory, you would
include the people who work in the old laboratory in the design process to make sure it meets their requirements and make sure that they're happy with the design. You wouldn't necessarily accept all their comments, but you would pass it by them because they're going to be using it.
So at the moment, my writing that you simply haven't seen any of that anywhere in the material you were given.
No, I haven't seen any of that, and but I mean, as I say, I you know, maybe it did exist, but it just seems a little bit odd.
And you did I also understand you to take something from the fact that when the hospital was opened, people started expressing surprise at what was provided?
Yes, yes.
So whoever was expressing surprise didn't know about it.
Yes, and that's not just the infection control people, that's some of the is it Professor Gibson? I don't think she was infection control, was she?
No,
You know, people like that are expressing, wait a minute, this is not what we expect.
just so that I understand something you said a moment or two ago, Mr. Bennett, you gave the example of a PFI. Now, I think I know what you meant.
Yes.
Let me run it back to make sure that I understand the point. Your general point is that you would expect the ultimate users to be consulted in design,
Yes.
just as with your lab.
Yes.
Now, why I think you mentioned PFI, and tell me if I'm wrong about that, is that in such a contract, and I don't think this may not apply to the Queen Elizabeth, but in such a contract, the ultimate users are acquiring a service or a building that's provided by the project company.
Yes.
And therefore, it may be in a PFI contract, the ultimate users, first of all, encounter the building at handover. Was that the point that you had in mind?
Yes.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think it was quite clear the way you put it, but I just wanted to make sure I'd followed that. Mr. Connell.
Thank you. Can we just go to another page of your conclusions, because I'm not going to go through all of them. It's heading compliance with guidance on page 724. And you've already made the point about the consistency of guidance on pressures and so on and so forth as we've gone through your evidence. I just want to make sure there's no misunderstanding about what you say about chilled beams in 10.13. You say that there's a change of attitude between 2007 and 2021. Now, am I right in remembering that 2007 is the first time chilled beams made an appearance in
I think it was, yes.
the documentation that you've seen? And then by 2021, they're not viewed so favourably.
Yes.
But it wasn't until that latter period that change was made to the guidance, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
So I have to come back to the question of risk again, I'm afraid. Because your report says, you know, if you don't have, air change rates that are as specified, if you don't have positive pressure pascals, if you don't have HEPA filters, you don't have that package of protection for the particular patients. I think the point that's being suggested is, well, if you can't calculate any of this, because you can't say, well, it's a 13% increased risk or a 22% increased risk. How do you know there's any risk at all, other than just your professional view based on your experience?
I mean, there's obviously some theoretical risk, and you can see theoretical routes of transmission. But, I mean, if I'm a senior manager, or if I'm in charge of a hospital like this, and you know, and it's built to a certain standard, it's built to the standard that is written down, then I can say I've controlled the risk. But if anything goes wrong, you're looking at where you've been below standard. Now, that may not be the cause of a problem, but in reality, that is the way people will look at it. There's, in a car, you've got so many sort of safety mechanisms in it, and some of them, I'm sure there's absolutely no evidence for their use, but a car manufacturer's not going to take that out to save a bit of money.
So well, let me just put it back to you this way. You've identified the difficulty in measuring the amount of risk
Yes.
that there is, but you've maintained in your report that there is a risk in all of these situations. There is an increased risk if you don't have air change rates and so on.
I think, I mean, that's such a general question. I think if you don't have a HEPA filter in a BMT room, there is a theoretical risk of the person in that room being exposed to an environmental pathogen that could greatly affect their condition. If you have a HEPA filter in the ward, there is no way that, if it's correctly operating, correctly installed, that they will have any exposure to an environmental a microorganism through the air. Now, it may be that we've got lovely air in Glasgow and the HEPA filter is totally not required because there wasn't anything nasty in the air. But then again, it might not be. But putting a figure to these things is terribly, terribly difficult.
And is the same true of the issue with positive pressure that you explained to us earlier, that positive pressure in immunocompromised individuals, or negative pressure but the other way around, but let's stick to positive for the moment, is used to try and prevent anything in the corridor entering the room of the immunocompromised patient?
Yes.
And it works in the sense that the physics works. It keeps it out. So if you followed the logic you've just explained, it is possible that somewhere in that corridor there is an opportunistic pathogen that, if you didn't have pressure, could get in.
Yes.
It might or it might not, but that's what you're avoiding.
Yeah.
Is that what you're telling us?
Yes, yeah. I mean, a lot of things is, in microbiology and infection, a lot of things are, it's old Swiss cheese sort of thing, line up all the holes, So it's part, we're talking belt and braces, we're talking a lot of layers of protection, and some of them may have limited impact, but we really don't know. But we know theoretically that if I'm coming into work and I don't realise I've got COVID, and I'm walking past a ward with an immunocompromised person, and the room is operating correctly, there is absolutely no way that I'm going to infect that person in the room. But
And-
if there isn't any, if the room is at neutral pressure and there's no HEPA, then there is a possibility that just by walking past, the aerosol that is generated may go into the room.
And if I just then follow that sequence, if you then enter the room of the immunocompromised patient, which has the other protections, and your mask doesn't happen to be precisely fitting or whatever, is there then a possibility that some element of aerosol leaks and affects the patient?
Yes. I mean, you could also say that you should also have a system in which people don't come to work if they've got a temperature and you're testing. There's all these sort of there's these different layers of protection, of which the ventilation is one of them.
But I just want to ask you one more question about that, because we had evidence from Mr. Hoffman earlier in the inquiry, who we dragged out of retirement, and he expressed a view that in relation to immunocompromised patients, first key was HEPA, second key was positive pressure, but actually air changes didn't matter because there was nothing to dilute.
I don't often agree with Peter, but yes, I'd generally say that's fair comment. I mean, air change is the lowest. If I had to rank them, having 10 air changes an hour would be lower than having a positive pressure HEPA filtered room.
And the logic behind his position, as I understood it, was that assumed that nothing came into that room that needed dilution. And
Yes,
in
so,
that
I mean,
event, you're fine.
You assume that the person coming into that room is not going to turn up to work with a respiratory virus, is going to be wearing a complete change of clothes, a sterile clothes, and will not pose a risk to the person in the room. So, yeah, I would say if I had to make a choice, I'd accept the 2.5 air changes, but I'd keep the HEPA and I'd keep the positive pressure.
As I understood it, you've addressed this point before. If you assume a sterile air in the room because of 100% effective HEPA filtration, air changes have nothing to contribute in addition. But you have to make that, first of all, you have to make that assumption that what we're talking about is an effectively HEPA filtered local environment. And as Mr. Connell has explored with you, no potential source of contamination being introduced into the room, such as a visitor.
I mean, there is one slight complication to this, of course, is the fact that you've got CBU in the room to keep it comfortable. So 2.5 air changes without a CBU might make it difficult to control the heat in the room.
I think probably Mr. Hoffman accepted that air change rate contributed to patient comfort.
Yeah.
And also to protection of patients and others where there was an infectious person in the room, which is the other end of the discussion. Thank you. Now, Mr. Bennett, I'm going to move from your report, and I just want to touch briefly on the direction 5 process that followed, where you were asked questions and asked to give written answers, because I suspect we can move reasonably quickly through these. We find the questions and your responses in Bundle 21, Volume 6 at page 97. And we find there that the front sheet and the actual questions start on page 98. And I'm just going to run through these to make sure we've got your answers clearly. Question 1, how should PPVL rooms be used for high consequence infectious diseases? And you say they shouldn't, because they're not recommended for that. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah. I mean, high consequence infectious diseases are quite high levels of high level organisms.
Right.
Yeah.
How do you deal with them?
You have a special facilities. I mean, I think there's a network of hospitals who provide awards for people who are suffering high consequence infectious diseases. I'm not sure where that is in Scotland, if there is one.
It may not matter for present purposes. And then you were asked quite a technical question in question 2 about the PPVL room in the Hambria study that you'd instanced and the PPVL design in the SHTM, and you set out a lot of the technical responses to that. I don't think we need trouble you with that. And you asked a question about question 6. To what extent would a failure to identify many fungal species are not covered by ozoconazole prophylaxis impact on the risks? And you say, not my area, I'm not a clinician. Then you asked, to what extent, if any, do they identified risks of chill beam units apply to all patients in general ward rooms? And basically you say it depends, is that right?
Yes, yeah, I think depends.
Patients spending longer times precise or having particular exercises carried out
Yes.
may have different impacts.
Yes.
And we'll leave question 8. I don't think you can add much on that. But we probably come to a similar question to ones I asked you a little while ago, where the question is, in relation to paragraph 7.2 of your report, how did the limited evidence base impact your conclusions? Just take us through your response to that, because it may be important to understand exactly what you're saying.
Well, I think, basically, the laws of physics don't change, and we know that a correctly operating isolation room can prevent either the flow of particulate into the room or out of the room. That's the laws of physics still hold. Like that is what it may vary for different designs of the room, but the evidence base is very much lacking. But then again, to get the evidence base, you almost need to have guinea pigs.
Yes, indeed. And it was, in a sense, question 10 is a similar one. Why, given all of that, are you still confident? And you just say you think these rooms do help. In question 11, you asked, did you give consideration as to whether the environment as a whole presented an additional risk to patients beyond what would be expected in a comparable hospital environment? And you answered no. You would just look at ventilation.
Yeah.
And then you asked probably a more general question in 12, what additional analysis requires to be done to address the question of whether reduced air change rates lead to an increased risk of infection? And just give us your answer to that, so we are understanding what that means.
I think ventilation has become of great interest because of the COVID pandemic, and many people have tried to use mathematical modelling to demonstrate the impact of different air changes on the transmission of COVID under different sort of surfaces, such as in offices and the like. And so you can use such an approach. The problem is, I think, deciding what your assumptions are. And a real issue that, one of my areas of interest has always been air sampling, but it's astonishingly difficult to get an idea of the generation of microbial aerosol from an infected person, even though...
Sorry, I missed this. Mr. Bennett, my fault. You've always been interested in air sampling.
Yes.
And I didn't hear what you went on to say.
Okay, so basically, if you want to do a mathematical model of the impact of air change rates, you need to have a source term. And that source term will be, let's say we want to see what would, say you've got COVID and you're generating at a certain rate, what's the likelihood of you transmitting to there, and there under different air change rates? To do that, you really have to have a feel for exactly what you're generating when you've got COVID. The problem about that is everybody's different. People go through different stages of infection. People get infected in different ways. People produce aerosols during different routes. So it's very difficult to get a correct source term that is realistic to model what an infected person produces.
I rather suspect that source term is a technical expression.
Yeah.
And it's not one that you're giving me an example of
Yes.
my being a source term, but for my note, how would you define source term?
Okay. Basically, source term, you basically create a mathematical function in which, for example, you're generating 1,000 infectious units per minute from yourself. You then input that into a mathematical model that models the flows of the air around the room, and model it at 2.5 air changes and model at 10 air changes, and then see what the concentrations are there, and there, and then see whether the likelihood is that the air change rate would make a significant change to the potential of infecting somebody.
Now, in that example, the source term is 1,000 infective units per minute.
Yes.
Right. And the difficulty that you previously identified was deciding on the utility of that assumed source term.
Yes.
Right.
And it gets a bit more complicated because obviously it depends on particle size.
Right.
So if you're producing 20 micron particles, I think we're probably all safe. But if you're producing 2 micron particles, we might have to worry a little bit. But it's very difficult to get this information to make a good model for a lot of technical reasons and operational reasons.
I'll maybe just take the opportunity of intervening with Mr. Connell's permission. As you may be aware, we've had previous hearings concentrating on the Edinburgh Hospital, and following these hearings, in which I heard evidence about ventilation and its possible relationship with infection risk, I was invited to consider the possibility of making a recommendation that there should be more research in relation to the relationship between ventilation and a risk. Now, that's a very easy recommendation to make. I recommend that other people go away and work in a way that I'm not suggesting how they work, just they should go away and do some work. Now, my question to you would be, would such a recommendation actually be redundant, because that work is already being done? So what I'm looking to you for is, from your perspective, is there work underway, or as one might expect, having regard to our experience of the pandemic?
I can't say I'm up to date with the work that is being carried out at present. A lot of work I've seen has not been carried out in the hospital environment. I worry sometimes. The problem, you sometimes get things get so stylized that they don't mean anything. Because you've got to decide assumptions and variables and all this sort of stuff, and I don't like to say anything.
Okay.
I also know the sort of people who would get money from doing this work, and I think I could be accused of having a conflict of interest by saying, "Oh, yeah, give lots of money to my mates" or something like that.
Yeah. I think what I was wanting to avoid was making a rather superficial recommendation in circumstances where people are probably hard at work already.
I think there's an interesting issue about where I always think the interesting issue in everything is where you get your bang for the buck. You know, what is actually, because we're all going about ventilation, but it may be that the fantastic care and the procedures carried out by the staff at the hospital are doing far more to protect patients than spending lots of money on ventilation. You have to remember that the people who dropped the air change rate at least were doing it partially for care for the environment. So there is always a bit of a balance, I think, between a lot of things. And I think looking for more sustainable hospitals is a great thing, but also being aware of potential impacts of that. I think that's an interesting area. So, I don't know, am I rambling? I
did ask you a very general question.
There's something really interesting. I mean, that's why I think it's if the people had done a bit of work looking at the drop of air change rate and shown that actually argued the fact that actually in most instances this won't make a difference, and because of this, and this, and this, then that's a valuable contribution. So I think it's just so difficult, this area.
Right. Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Cole.
Well, I think the only follow-on question I have to that is that one of the points you've made is that the existing recommendations, which apply throughout the UK and seem to have come from, well, there are lots of similarities, at least, to some of the American recommendations. They seem to have been in place for quite a long time,
Yes.
as these things go, and have remained fixed at that level. So the question is there anyone out there that you're aware of that's digging around trying to find whether these should change or should be different, or whether the focus should move from A to B instead of C to D or whatever. Are you aware of it? Anything that would help His Lordship on that point?
I'm not sure. I mean, I must say, I really know nothing about what's done in Europe. You know, I wonder how they deal with those sort of issues. I know the one people who are still interested in this sort of stuff are the Scandinavians. There's still groups, and one thing is a lot of this research. I think people believed that everything had been solved by 1980, and so there's not many people doing, especially, and there's not many people totally linked into hospitals doing this sort of work.
So there's not many people.
You know, with linkages to hospitals doing this sort of work, and a lot of the people, the experts you see are even older than I am. But you know, so the problem is just some of the knowledge behind this, I think, starts to get a little bit lost. And it may be that some of this stuff does need to be revisited, but it's so difficult to do experiments in this sort of area.
Well, I think I just have, I'll explain why in a moment. Just have one more question. I just want to pick up one more of the answers in your Direction 5 questions. You remember a moment or two ago, I took you to a section of your report where you touched on prophylaxis and you made a comment about it. And in question 13 in your Direction 5 questions, the questioner says, well, what's the basis of your opinion as a non-clinician? So there's obviously a criticism levied there that prophylaxis should not be used. And I'd just like you to take us through your answer, because it's quite an interesting one, I suggest. Do you just explain what the point you're making there is?
Okay, I mean, if you take if you give a patient some prophylaxis to prevent them being infected by a pathogen, and that prophylaxis has no side effects, then it's an absolute no-brainer. If you need to give a patient a prophylaxis that will make the patient feel pretty rubbish, make them feel ill, then you have to think about the almost like the cost-benefit analysis. Is it worth putting this patient through this feeling bad in order to protect them? What I'm saying here is that in general, I think it's better to use a protective environment to protect a patient than give them heavy-duty prophylaxis that will really not be good for them. However, that's a clinical opinion. You know, I mean, and also for some people, maybe it may be that. It's funny. I saw a comment, I forget, from one of the a report by a doctor, I think, for the hospital, in which he was saying that he was really impressed by the use of prophylaxis at the QEUH, because they don't do it at his hospital. But they weren't using it at his hospital because they probably had a better sort of ventilation system. But this is all I mean, it's all, these are all clinical decisions. And it may be that at the end of the day, if they don't have a HEPA filter, it may be that they are obliged to use the prophylaxis. And again, if it's going to, I mean, there's always different drivers. There's always different things. There's money. There's sustainability. There's patience. There's that whole sort of thing. So it could be argued that it's worth using prophylaxis to save 10 million quid because you're not using HEPA filters. And I mean, as I said, I don't know about the prophylaxis, how bad the side effects are and how awful they are. You know, I really have no feel for that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Bennett. My Lord, these are all the questions I had intended to ask Mr. Bennett, at least as I say, as at present advised, on his general ventilation paper. I'm conscious he has a paper on Cryptococcus and some Direction 5 questions on Cryptococcus. So I'm also conscious that normally we would have a break to see whether anything arising had given rise to questions, but I was perhaps going to tentatively suggest that the sensible thing to do would be to rise now, since it's 4 o'clock in any event. If there are questions that people wish raised, they can intimate them, in the earlier part of tomorrow morning, and then we can pick up on any general matters tomorrow before we move on to Cryptococcus.
People might even take the opportunity of this afternoon to raise
Well,
questions with
it's
you.
always possible, my Lord, yes.
Mr. Bennett, I think we will follow Mr. Connell's suggestion. In other words, we will rise for today, and I look forward to see you at 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
As I look forward to see everyone else at 10 o'clock tomorrow.